When it comes to harvesting your herbs, especially when you're after the max medicinal qualities and properties, you have a very definite window, and actually quite a short window in some instances, on when you can harvest those. But you actually need to know what part of the plant has the most medicinal properties to it, and that can vary. So I am actually out, it's right at the tail end of summer, and I've got quite a few of my herbs that I do not have a backstock in my herbal apothecary. I need to get these harvested and put up. And I'm also out here filming some new lessons that are going into our Practical Home Herbalism course. So I thought it would be kind of the perfect opportunity to give you guys a sneak peek. You can see what some of those lessons are like. And then also just to kind of share with you some of the things that we have growing and just what I'm harvesting and stocking up in our herbal medicine cabinet. So you will see here, I've actually got two parts of mullein. I've got my mullein leaf and I've got my mullein blossoms, and I have some of my medicinal roses and some calendula. I'm actually going back to get more of the calendula, and the medicinal roses, the majority of these I'm letting go to rose hips. And I have just the very tail end last bit of the lavender harvest. I'm always so sad when I see these guys go. They're one of my favorite plants is lavender. So welcome to your sneak peek into the Practical Home Herbalism course. So there's a couple of general rules that you want to follow when you are harvesting your blossoms for medicinal purposes. General rule of thumb is you're going to wait until the dew has started to dry off, but before the maximum heat of the day. So ideally it's going to be mid to maybe late morning, depending on how hot the day is. That's your prime time. Then we really want to look at our blossoms. In most cases, for like mullein, calendula, echinacea, you're going to want to harvest your blossom right as it's opened and in its peak. So here I have a blossom that is really, this is starting to get a little ragged. You've got some damage here. Oops, and so it's so fragile it already fell off. So we want to be looking at them kind of right as they're just beginning to open. And then you're going to just simply come through, and when you're harvesting them, you don't want to just harvest the petals. We actually want to make sure we're getting the entire part of the blossom, see, including this part where the blossom goes in, because a lot of your medicinal properties, especially with calendula, are in this area too. So we're not just plucking the blossoms off, or petals off. We want the entire blossom. When we're harvesting them, we want to make sure that we're not crushing them. We don't want to release those medical properties until we're ready to actually use it in some of our different applications. So at harvest time, we want to be gentle and not crush any of our petals. So when it comes to our medicinal roses, same thing. This one you can see is really at the end. It's fully opened. These are starting to get a little bit faded and kind of wrinkly, not necessarily at its prime. Where we have this one here that's just starting to open, much more vibrant in its color. You can see this is much more bold, deeper color than we've got over here. So this is a perfect blossom to harvest. Now, the exception to these is going to be our lavender blossoms. So unlike the other blossoms that we want to just be freshly open, when it comes to harvesting your lavender, you actually want to harvest it when the buds are tight and are unopened. That is when lavender is at its highest medicinal properties. So that would be this right here. So you can see all of these buds are still tight and closed, but are fully formed. They're bright and they're purple here. Whereas when you come to this one, they have opened up. In fact, some of these you can see where the blossoms have opened up here. That's an open blossom. And then these have already died off. So these were open, but these have died off and are dark. So this is not at an ideal state. This is too far gone. You're not going to get the strong medicinal properties that you will when it's at this state. Now, when it comes to preparing your blossoms, some are going to be best dried, and then others you want to use fresh. And sometimes it depends on the application. For example, with our mullein blossoms, if you're going to be making the oil, then you definitely want these to be dried before you infuse them into your oil. However, if you're making a tincture, you actually want your mullein blossoms to be fresh, because when it comes to tincturing, they have a higher medicinal property when fresh. So you're going to want to make sure that you grab your download guide. We will have a chart in there that has indications on best used fresh or best used dried, or as the example with mullein, depending on what exactly you're making out of it. Now, the cool thing is if you're a student and in the course, you get extensive download guides and charts that go with and accompany each and every lesson. And I'm talking like extensive. These are fabulous charts and resources to have. But for those of you who are here hanging out with me on YouTube, I also wanted to include the tutorial on how to harvest your herbal leaves for maximum potency. So one of the first things that you need to know is if the plant is an annual, biennial, or a perennial. So an annual is something that is just going to grow for 1 year. So the seed is going to germinate and sprout. It's going to develop its leaves. It's then going to develop a flower, which will turn into the seeds. And as soon as the first frost comes, that plant is dead. So all of that life cycle happens in 1 year. That's your annual plants. Then we've got our biennials. And so biennials are going to germinate from seed the first year. And the first year, they're just going to be producing their leaf. The second year, they will then produce their flowering stalk. That flower will then mature into seed and drop in order to keep that plant going. But then it is dead after that second year. It's not going to come back again. That's your biennial. You've got your perennials, which of course, provided that nothing happens to them disease-wise or something catastrophic, once planted and established, which could be from seed or a cutting or a crown, depending on what the type of plant is, it is going to come back every single year. It usually goes into dormancy over the winter months, but then come spring, you're going to get a new set of blossoms. So think roses, lavender, those are our type of perennial plants once planted. Then they just flourish, ideally, if they've given the correct conditions, but they come back for us every year. So the key thing to know about that is you may be harvesting leaves off of perennial plants, annual plants, and biennials, but you do need to know which type of plant it is first. So for an annual, you would want to be harvesting the leaves off of an annual plant before it goes to blossom and bud. So you have a shorter window, usually in the early spring to maybe early summer. So a fairly short window on an annual. When it comes to your biennials, for example, here is a mullein plant. This is a biennial. So in its first year, you have just this rosette. So I would want to be harvesting my leaf off of my mullein in that first year. And you don't want to harvest all of the leaves because the plant does need these leaves to be able to feed back to the root when it goes into dormancy so that it has enough strength and vitality to then come back next year and send up a flower blossom. So general rule of thumb is you want to harvest about a third of the leaves on a biennial when you're after the leaf harvest in its first year before it goes to blossom in the second year. Now when it comes to perennials, a little bit more similar to the annual, but you'll still see a pattern here. Whenever we're harvesting the leaves, we want to do it when the plant is not in blossom. And the reason for that is because once a plant goes to blossom, it's putting the majority of its energy into the blossom part, which means some of the medicinal properties leave the leaves and they're going into the blossom. So if we're after the leaf part, we want to make sure that we're harvesting that when there is no blossoms, because that is when the leaves have the strongest medicinal property. So same thing with your perennials. Once they've leafed out in the springtime or early summer, depending on what the plant is, You want to harvest those leaves, not stripping the entire plant. The plant does need some of its leaves in order to continue its growth cycle and photosynthesis, but up to a third before it has formed the blossoms. Once it's formed the blossoms, then it would be blossom harvest, but you would not want to be harvesting the leaves if you're after the maximum medicinal potency, which when you're using herbs medicinally, you are. So whenever you're harvesting the leaves, we do want to look at the ones that are in prime, which are usually going to be the ones more in the center, at least with mullein. It's growing, the center leaves are the youngest. You can see that. And so these ones are obviously smaller. Whereas you come out here and we've got some of these that are starting to get a little bit of damage on them. So some of these could just be, sunspots, could be bug damage. Here I've gotten some of the leaves that are a little bit eaten. They've been eaten by things, and you've just got some things like here coming in. These ones are obviously, dying back and dead. You don't want these. These are not in their prime. So you want to come to wherever the young part is, and then we're simply just going to come and we're going to pick these. Again, you want to make sure that you're not crushing your leaf matter when you're picking them until we're actually making whatever we're making with them. We don't want to release the medicinal properties. Let's see, and I've actually got 2 mullein plants here growing side by side. So I am just taking the center between the 2 of these, making sure that I'm only harvesting a third. Now, depending on the actual leaves, how you're intending on using these, if you're going to be using them dried or putting them into a tincture, and it can also depend on if their maximum potency is when they're fresh or when they are dried. That'll be in your download guide. We'll have a whole list there that will inform you on the best ways to use them. If you're wanting to learn more about herbs specifically during cold and flu season, then make sure that you're registered for the free live class that I'm doing October 21st. Again, that link is beneath this video. Make sure you go and snag your free seat for that. I can't wait to see you in that class. And in the meantime, we've got some other videos that will walk you through harvesting things like calendula and making one of my favorite infused oils.